Picture a candlelit chamber deep within a medieval castle, where a group of young girls huddle over maps not of kingdoms, but of minds, learning not just to navigate the world, but to command it. In an era when women were expected to whisper, these girls were taught to wield power with such subtlety that empires would bend without ever realizing who truly pulled the strings. This is the lost legacy of the secret schools that groomed history's most formidable women institutions, so carefully hidden that for centuries their existence was nothing more than a rumor. How did daughters of nobles and even commoners gain access to knowledge forbidden to their gender? Who dared to teach them the arts of statecraft, cryptography, and war in a world that denied them the right to rule? Behind the tapestry of medieval history, where kings and conquerors dominate the narrative, lies a shadow network of education that defied every convention. These weren't just schools, they were laboratories of power, where girls as young as 12 mastered Latin to read banned political treatises, practiced diplomacy through coded letters, and learned to turn societal invisibility into their greatest weapon. Imagine the irony. The very prejudices that kept women out of palaces and battlefields became the perfect camouflage for their education. While men dismissed them as decorative or docile, these students were dissecting military strategies and memorizing the weaknesses of every noble house in Europe. What makes their story so extraordinary isn't just their defiance, it's their sheer effectiveness. The graduates of these covert academies didn't just survive in a man's world, they redefined it. Some became empresses who steered nations through crises, others the unseen hands behind thrones, and a few legendary spies whose networks stretched across continents. Their influence was so pervasive that historians now trace pivotal moments, treaties, succession crises, even the fall of dynasties back to decisions made by women educated in these hidden halls. Yet perhaps their most revolutionary act was proving that leadership isn't inherited through gender, but cultivated through knowledge. As we peel back layers of time to uncover their classrooms, their textbooks, and their astonishing victories, you'll discover how a handful of clandestine lessons shook the foundations of medieval power and why their legacy still whispers to us today. Long before universities welcomed women through their doors, a quiet revolution was taking place in the dimly lit corners of medieval society. These secret schools didn't announce themselves with grand buildings or official decrees. They existed in the spaces between what was permitted and what was possible. Often, they began as nothing more than a noblewoman's private library or a convent scriptorium, where curious minds could gather under the guise of piety. But behind closed doors, the lessons were anything but conventional. Take Byzantium in the 10th century, where Empress Theophano, herself a foreign bride who'd mastered the intricacies of imperial politics, quietly funded tutors for her inner circle of noble daughters. These weren't just etiquette coaches, they were retired diplomats, battle-scarred generals, and even scholars from the famed University of Constantinople, all sworn to secrecy. Across the Mediterranean in Moorish Spain, the tradition ran even deeper. In Cordoba's labyrinthine Alcazar, wealthy families pooled resources to hire female scholars, women who'd studied mathematics in Baghdad or philosophy in Damascus, to teach their daughters the arts of statecraft alongside poetry. What's fascinating is how these schools adapted to their environments. In convents, lessons were hidden in plain sight. A nun teaching Latin might embed political theory into translations of religious texts. A music master could use compositions to explain battlefield signaling, and in castles where prying eyes were everywhere, tutors employed a language of doublespeak. Botany lessons included the medicinal properties of plants and which ones made effective poisons. Embroidery patterns held coded messages about alliance networks. Even dance rehearsals became exercises in spatial strategy, teaching girls to navigate court intrigues as deftly as they moved through a pavane. The founders of these schools were pragmatists as much as idealists. Some, like the formidable Countess Matilda of Tuscany, saw education as armor for women inheriting dangerous political legacies. Others, like the anonymous benefactors behind Paris's so-called Rose Court Academy, believed that educated women could stabilize kingdoms by advising husbands and sons. And then there were the rulers who played both sides, men like Alfonso VI of Leon, who publicly upheld tradition while privately ensuring his daughters could debate law and economics as fiercely as any prince. What united them all was a quiet understanding. In a world where women's voices were meant to be decorative, knowledge was the ultimate disguise. A girl who could quote Aristotle while demurely lowering her eyes or reference treaty terms while pouring wine became a power no one thought to guard against. And so these schools persisted not as rebellions but as open secrets, flourishing in the blind spot of a society that never imagined how much a woman might learn if given the chance. At first glance, a visitor to one of these secret schools might mistake it for an ordinary noblewoman's chamber until they noticed the unusual text spread across the tables. Instead of simple prayer books or romances, girls pored over Sun Tzu's The Art of War in Arabic translations, annotated copies of Plato's Republic, and hand-copied manuals on siege warfare. The curriculum was meticulously crafted to transform students into polymaths of power, blending scholarly knowledge with razor-sharp practicality. Languages formed the foundation. Fluency in Latin, Greek, and Arabic wasn't just about reading poetry. It was a tool to intercept correspondence, forge alliances, and decode diplomatic missives. A girl who could casually converse with foreign ambassadors in their native tongue became an asset no court could ignore. Philosophy lessons went far beyond abstract debates. Students dissected Aristotle's Politics to understand the mechanics of power, while Stoic teachings trained them to mask emotions during high-stakes negotiations. Mock diplomatic sessions were a hallmark of the training, with girls role-playing as warring nobles or merchants haggling over treaties. The most skilled negotiators learned to spot weaknesses in arguments, turning opponents' words against them, a technique famously employed by Elena of Aquitaine during her tenure as regent. Military strategy was taught not with swords but with chessboards and sand tables, where students recreated famous battles and proposed alternate outcomes. One surviving manuscript from Moorish Spain even shows teenage girls critiquing Hannibal's Alpine campaign, their margin notes debating supply lines and morale tactics. But the most extraordinary lessons lay in the shadows. Advanced students mastered cryptography, translating innocuous-sounding letters into reveals of troop movements or marriage pacts. They practiced steganography, hiding messages in embroidery patterns, music compositions, or even the arrangement of flowers in a bouquet. A surviving Venetian manual details how girls trained in the art of the unobserved glance, learning to memorize entire documents after a single covert reading. Espionage techniques were refined through elaborate games. One convent's records describe a yearly, silent war where students competed to plant false information or intercept secret notes without detection. The true brilliance of this education lay in its duality. Publicly, a graduate might be praised for her piety or musical talent, qualities society expected. Privately, she carried the ability to draft legal arguments, negotiate trade agreements, or dismantle a rival spy network. This was empowerment disguised as decorum, a revolution stitched into the fabric of tradition. When Marguerite of Navarre used her linguistic skills to mediate the Peace of Cambrai, or when the Byzantine Princess Anna Komnine authored a military history so precise it's still studied today, they weren't exceptions. They were products of a system that had spent centuries perfecting the art of turning knowledge into influence. The genius of these secret schools lay not just in what they taught, but in how they remained invisible to the very societies they sought to transform. To the untrained eye, a classroom of girls copying psalms or practicing lute melodies appeared perfectly ordinary, yet beneath the surface, every activity served a dual purpose. Take the convent schools of Saxony, where parchment-making workshops doubled as cryptography lessons. While ostensibly preparing vellum for religious texts, students learned to create invisible inks from lemon juice or alum, embedding political messages between lines of scripture. A visiting bishop might admire their piety, never suspecting they were mastering the art of clandestine communication. Other institutions adopted even bolder disguises. In Burgundy, the famed Château des Roses outwardly functioned as an exclusive finishing school where noble daughters perfected embroidery and courtly manners. But the floral patterns they stitched contained coded maps of regional alliances, with rose colors indicating friendly houses and thorn placements marking potential enemies. Music lessons went beyond simple entertainment. Complex compositions held acrostic messages, teaching girls to encode intelligence in madrigals. Even dance rehearsals served as tactical exercises, with footwork patterns mirroring military maneuvers. The physical spaces themselves were masterclasses in deception. Many schools operated within existing structures, like the Venetian Palazzo, whose library concealed a soundproof chamber behind a false bookshelf. Here, tutors whispered analyses of naval battles while servants in the hallway heard only muffled readings of poetry. Some Moorish academies in Granada built lecture halls beneath courtyard gardens, their entrances hidden by cascading vines. The most secure locations employed rotating meeting places, a tactic borrowed from spy networks, with lessons shifting between a tapestry workshop one day and a seemingly innocent herb garden the next. Key to maintaining secrecy were the tutors themselves, often handpicked for their ability to navigate both worlds. A venerable abbess might be a retired diplomat in disguise, while a frail-looking music master could have once served as a military cryptographer. They spoke in layered language, referencing classical myths to discuss real political scandals, or using gardening metaphors to explain assassination plots. Records from a Swiss school describe how tutors staged moral plays, where biblical heroines like Judith or Deborah became case studies in strategic leadership, a guise that satisfied local clergy while imparting crucial lessons. Perhaps the most effective camouflage was society's own prejudices, because few believed women capable of complex political thought. Even blatant clues went unnoticed. A noblewoman quoting Tacitus at dinner was assumed to be parroting her husband's words, a meticulously kept ledger of grain prices, merely domestic diligence. This societal blindness allowed graduates to operate with astonishing freedom, their education hidden in the open, like a sword sheathed in silk. Theodora's rise from the theater stages of Constantinople to the imperial throne reads like something out of legend, but her real power came not from her dramatic past, but from the secretive education she received as a young woman. While history remembers her as Justinian's wife, those trained in the shadow curriculum knew her as a master of legal theory and political maneuvering. Behind closed doors, she debated with scholars, dissected Roman law, and honed an uncanny ability to read the ambitions of every courtier. When the Nika riots nearly toppled Justinian's reign, it was Theodora who recognized the strategic value of holding the palace while others panicked. Her famous declaration, "Purple makes a fine shroud," wasn't just bravery. It was the calculated risk of someone who'd spent years studying revolt patterns and crowd psychology. The laws she later championed, granting women property rights and protections against forced prostitution, bore the unmistakable imprint of her education, a blend of philosophical principle and ruthless pragmatism. Across the Mediterranean in Cordoba, Walada bint al-Mustakfi wielded poetry like a scimitar. Educated in one of Al-Andalus's most progressive academies, she mastered the art of political verse, where every metaphor carried double meaning. Her salon became a nerve center of Umayyad power, where a well-placed couplet could make or break a vizier's career. When she famously stitched lines of her poetry into her robes, "I am fit for high positions by God's grace," it wasn't vanity, but a tactical display of intellectual pedigree. Walada's graduates, including the warrior poet Zainab al-Mariya, would go on to advise emirs and negotiate tribal alliances, proving that words could be as decisive as swords. Then there were the lesser-known but equally formidable products of these schools, like Sicilgata of Salerno. Trained in a Lombard noblewoman's clandestine court of wisdom, she spoke 5 languages fluently and could debate medical treatises with the monks of Monte Cassino. When her husband Robert Guiscard marched on Byzantium, it was Sicilgata who navigated the logistical nightmares of supplying an army across the Adriatic, a skill learned not on battlefields, but in classroom sand tables where girls simulated siege logistics. Her contemporaneous chroniclers, baffled by her strategic acumen, attributed it to feminine intuition, missing the years of covert education that prepared her to outmaneuver seasoned generals. The Byzantine Princess Anna Komnine stands as perhaps the ultimate testament to these schools' rigor. Fluent in medicine, military history, and Aristotelian logic by her teens, she authored the Alexiad, a chronicle of her father's reign so meticulously detailed that modern historians still rely on its accounts of battlefield formations and diplomatic protocols. Her frustrated ambition to rule, thwarted by her younger brother, led her to create something more enduring, a masterclass in how to document power when you're denied wielding it. What united these women wasn't just their intellect, but their ability to leverage education as a force multiplier. Where society saw wives, mothers, or decorative consorts, these graduates saw networks of influence waiting to be activated. A Moorish queen might use her knowledge of irrigation systems to broker alliances between desert tribes. A Frankish noblewoman could turn her study of Roman tax codes into a system that doubled her estate's revenues. Every lesson had a purpose. Every skill, from cryptography to contract law, became a thread they wove into the fabric of empires, their greatest triumph. Making the extraordinary seem inevitable, as if their brilliance was simply a matter of birth rather than the product of schools that dared to teach girls how to reshape the world. Monasteries and convents, with their high walls and sacred reputations, became the perfect hiding places for knowledge deemed too dangerous for women. Behind the veil of religious devotion, something far more revolutionary was unfolding. Classrooms where girls learned to parse scripture, not just for spiritual guidance, but for its political implications. Take the Abbey of Quedlinburg in 10th century Germany, where the iron-willed Abbess Mathilda presided over what appeared to be a quiet house of prayer. In reality, her scriptorium buzzed with activity as noblewomen copied not only psalms, but annotated histories of Charlemagne's military campaigns. The abbey's famed library, stocked with volumes on canon law, doubled as a training ground for understanding how religious doctrine could shape royal succession. This sacred camouflage worked because the church itself was a paradox. While officially upholding patriarchal structures, certain branches, particularly those led by aristocratic abbesses, became unlikely champions of female erudition. A nun teaching Latin might pause over a passage from St. Paul's letters, using it to spark debates about governance. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's wasn't just a spiritual lesson, it was a framework for discussing taxation policies. In convents like Gandersheim, students practiced rhetoric by drafting hypothetical letters to popes and kings, their arguments laced with carefully chosen biblical citations that gave their political opinions divine weight. The protection of the cloister extended beyond mere physical walls. When bishops or nobles grew suspicious of educated women, the sacred nature of these spaces provided immunity. A noblewoman studying Aristotle's Politics could claim she was merely examining theological commentaries if interrupted. Even more brilliant was how these institutions weaponized piety itself. The more ostentatiously a convent displayed traditional virtues, chanting, fasting, embroidery, the more radical its hidden curriculum could become. At Essen Abbey, girls composed hymns by day while by night they decoded the financial records of local bishoprics, learning to track the flow of ecclesiastical wealth. Some of history's most formidable women emerged from this system. Hildegard of Bingen, though celebrated for her mystical visions, was first and foremost a product of monastic education. Her political correspondence with emperors and popes reveals a mind trained in both theology and statecraft, able to cite the Book of Revelation one moment and demand military support against rebellious vassals the next. Similarly, the Abbess Adelaide of Willich used her position as a spiritual leader to broker peace treaties between warring Rhineland lords, her negotiations steeped in biblical precedent. What made these religious schools so effective was their dual currency. In a world where power derived from both the sword and the cross, their graduates spoke fluently in both languages. They could quote Deuteronomy to justify land reforms or invoke the virtues of Saint Agnes to shame warmongering barons. When the Hungarian Princess Margaret retired to a Dominican convent, she transformed it into a de facto diplomatic hub, receiving envoys who assumed they were visiting a pious recluse, only to find themselves negotiating with a woman who could recite every clause of the Golden Bull of 1222. The ultimate irony, many of these institutions were funded by the very men who would have opposed their mission if they'd understood it. Donations from kings and dukes, given to earn heavenly favor, quietly purchased the vellum on which girls analyzed feudal contracts. Gilded chalices given to convents were melted down to pay for tutors in Arabic mathematics. Even the church's own bureaucracy played an unwitting role. When papal inspectors visited, they praised the beautiful illuminations in manuscripts, never noticing the marginal notes comparing papal edicts to the strategies of Roman emperors. This sacred masquerade couldn't last forever. As the Church centralized power in Rome and the Reformation dawned, the autonomy of these convents eroded. But for centuries, they stood as proof that sometimes the best place to hide a revolution is in the light, where the glow of stained glass windows could conceal the spark of intellect being passed from one generation of women to the next. While Europe's convents disguised political lessons as piety, the academies of Al-Andalus operated under a different kind of cover, celebrated scholarship itself. In the bustling intellectual hubs of Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada, the pursuit of knowledge was so revered that girls' schools could flourish in plain sight, their existence masked by the broader culture of learning. But behind the marble courtyards and geometric libraries, these institutions cultivated something radical. Women who didn't just study science and philosophy, but applied them to reshape their world. Take the famed House of Wisdom in 10th century Cordoba. where the daughters of viziers and merchants sat alongside boys in astronomy lectures until the afternoon hours, when the real political education began. While mathematics lessons covered the movements of planets, advanced students learned to calculate troop movements and supply routes. Medical treatises weren't merely memorized, they became frameworks for understanding how disease could weaken an enemy's army or how public health policies might stabilize a restless populace. The physician Lubna of Cordoba, once a student in such a school, later served as the caliph's chief librarian, using her knowledge of optics to design signaling systems for military outposts. What set these academies apart was their seamless integration of arts and sciences with statecraft. A poetry recital might analyze verses not just for meter, but for coded messages about border tensions. Architecture lessons went beyond aesthetics. Students studied the defensive advantages of arched gates and the acoustic properties of courtyards where whispers could travel farther than shouts. Even culinary arts had strategic value. One surviving text from Seville details how girls practiced calculating feast budgets to understand the economic impact of royal hospitality. The relative openness of these schools was both a strength and a vulnerability. Unlike their European counterparts operating in literal shadows, Al-Andalus academies often enjoyed patronage from progressive rulers. The 11th century poet Walada Bint al-Mustakfi famously hosted literary salons where politics and art intertwined, her home becoming a nexus of influence. Yet even here, certain subjects required discretion. Manuals on cryptography were kept in locked chests labeled as medical texts, while discussions of succession laws were framed as hypothetical debates about ancient caliphates. Perhaps the most striking legacy of these schools lies in their tangible contributions to science. The astronomer Fatima al-Madriti not only compiled celestial tables used by navigators, but also advised emirs on the symbolic timing of treaty signings. The physician al-Sad's treatise on contagion theory influenced quarantine policies during outbreaks. These women didn't just learn, they innovated, their work quietly rewriting what was possible for female intellect in the medieval world. Yet for all their achievements, these academies depended on Al-Andalus' fragile climate of tolerance. As Christian reconquests intensified and religious conservatism grew, the schools adapted once more. Some relocated to the fortified Alhambra complex, their lessons hidden behind the very beauty that distracted outsiders. Mathematical principles embedded in tile patterns, political allegories woven into garden designs. Others dispersed into private homes, their libraries disguised as dowry chests. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the most vital knowledge had already been smuggled out, carried by graduates who had planted seeds in North Africa, Sicily, and beyond. What remains today are fragments: a star chart with annotations in a feminine hand, a medical text bearing the signature of a woman scribe, the persistent legends of the Lady Geometers, who could calculate the fall of kingdoms as easily as the trajectory of comets. These traces hint at a golden age when the pursuit of knowledge knew no gender, and the brightest minds, regardless of who they were, could chart the course of empires. Beneath the golden mosaics of Constantinople's great palace, where eunuchs and courtiers moved like pieces on a chessboard, the empire's most unconventional weapon was being forged: the minds of young women. Unlike the blunt instruments of war, these girls were sharpened through a curriculum so precise it could dissect an enemy's weakness with the same skill as a surgeon's scalpel. The Imperial School for Girls didn't announce itself with grand proclamations. It existed in the spaces between ceremony and secrecy, where silk curtains and the murmur of hymns masked debates over tax reforms and naval deployments. At first glance, the school appeared to be little more than an extension of the palace's gynaeceum, the traditional women's quarters where imperial daughters learned embroidery and piety. But the truth lay in the details. A visiting ambassador might note the girl's elegant Greek penmanship without realizing those same hands were drafting hypothetical peace treaties. Music lessons included not just hymns, but the study of sonic signaling used in naval battles. Even the famed Byzantine silk workshops served a dual purpose. While apprentices practiced weaving, they also decoded shipment records to understand trade routes that stretched from Alexandria to Kiev. The school's true genius lay in its faculty. Retired generals taught military logistics through board games, recreating famous campaigns with ivory pieces on inlaid tables. A blind philosopher, once the empire's chief legal advisor, drilled students in Justinian's code until they could recite clauses on inheritance law while blindfolded, a skill that later allowed Princess Anna Komnine to outmaneuver her brother's claim to the throne. Most surprising were the eunuch tutors, often dismissed as mere bureaucrats, who schooled their pupils in the art of bureaucratic warfare, how to delay an enemy's supplies with paperwork or sway a council vote by controlling the agenda. What made Constantinople the ideal setting for this experiment was its labyrinthine power structure. In a court where titles like Keeper of the Inkstand masked immense influence, educated women could operate unseen. A graduate might hold no official rank yet command a network of informants through carefully placed gifts to midwives and scribes. Others, like the 9th century Empress Theodora, used their training to purge the court of corrupt officials, methodically replacing them with competent appointees while publicly attributing the reforms to divine guidance. The school's most enduring legacy, however, was its mastery of symbolic power. Students learned that authority wasn't just about edicts but perception. When Irene of Athens seized the throne in 797, she didn't rely on force alone. She staged her coronation as a sacred ritual, with bishops anointing her as if by divine right. Decades later, another graduate, Zoe Porphyrogenita, turned her famed perfume laboratory into a political salon, where the scent of roses masked whispered alliances that would shape 3 reigns. By the time the Crusaders breached Constantinople's walls in 1204, the school had already dispersed its knowledge like seeds in the wind. Some graduates fled to Trebizond, where they established smaller but equally potent tutoring circles. Others carried their skills west, blending Byzantine statecraft with the emerging humanism of Renaissance Italy. The school itself vanished from records, its classrooms likely repurposed by conquerors who never guessed what had once been taught behind those marble walls. But its influence lingered in every empire where a woman's voice, trained in the shadow of the great palace, proved that the pen and the mind could be mightier than the sword. Far from the sunlit courtyards of Al-Andalus and the marble halls of Byzantium, another kind of secret school flourished in the damp stone manors of medieval Europe. Here, where winters were long and castles were isolated, education became a quiet act of rebellion, one that often began with a widow's grief. When a nobleman died, his estates didn't just pass to his sons. His widow frequently inherited the right to manage them. And so, in the flickering light of hearths across Normandy, Burgundy, and the Rhineland, practical women created something extraordinary. Clandestine classrooms where daughters learned not just to survive but to command. Take the case of Countess Adelaide of Auxerre, who in the 12th century turned her dower house into what later chroniclers would call a school of the keys. On the surface, it was a place where noble girls practiced embroidery and household accounts. But the real lessons lay in the details: how to interpret a steward's ledger for signs of embezzlement, how to calculate harvest yields to predict famine, even how to fortify a manor against siege. Adelaide's most famous pupil, Elena of Vermandois, would later use this training to defend her lands during a succession crisis, outmaneuvering male relatives who underestimated her grasp of military logistics. These northern schools operated under tighter constraints than their Mediterranean counterparts. Without the cover of convents or royal courts, they relied on layers of plausible deniability. A tutor might arrive under the guise of giving music lessons, only to spend afternoons explaining how to interpret heraldic symbols as intelligence reports. Manuscripts of romances, always permissible for women to read, were annotated with marginal notes comparing fictional battles to real political conflicts. Even needlework became subversive. The famed Bayeux tapestry, likely created in such an environment, isn't just a chronicle of the Norman conquest, it's a masterclass in how to visually narrate power. The scarcity of records speaks volumes. Unlike Byzantine or Moorish schools that occasionally boasted of their elite pupils, European noblewomen understood discretion was survival. What few traces remain often hide in plain sight. A psalter from Champagne with faint ink calculations of troop movements between the lines of prayers, or a troubadour's song about the lady who counts faster than the king's treasurers. Sometimes the evidence emerges from shocked reactions, like the bishop who complained in 1273 about noble daughters in Lorraine debating land deeds like advocates after visiting their aunt's estate. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the seasonal disguise. In regions where noble families rotated between castles, schools migrated with them, camouflaged as part of the household's natural movement. A lesson on bridge tariffs might occur during a summer progress, with girls calculating toll revenues while their carriage paused at crossings. Winter evenings by the fire became opportunities to study the political alliances woven into genealogy charts, knowledge that later helped heiresses like Margaret of Flanders negotiate marriages that doubled her territory. The true measure of these schools' success lies in the quiet revolutions they enabled. When Matilda of Tuscany held the Alpine passes against Emperor Henry IV, she wasn't just wielding her father's army, she was applying childhood lessons on terrain analysis. When Blanche of Castile ruled France as regent, her ability to outmaneuver rebellious barons drew on years of studying feudal law under the guise of ladies' devotions. These women didn't just inherit power, they reinvented it, proving that even in Europe's darkest castles, education could be the most potent weapon a woman might wield. The greatest power often lies not in the throne itself, but in the shadows around it, a truth these women understood better than anyone. While kings brandished swords and issued proclamations, their female counterparts wielded something far more subtle. An intricate web of influence woven through calculated words, strategic marriages, and the quiet placement of loyal allies. Consider Matilda of Flanders, wife to William the Conqueror, who never held a crown in her own name yet shaped Norman England's destiny. When William embarked on his invasion of England, it was Matilda who governed Normandy in his absence, not as a placeholder, but as a ruler who deftly crushed rebellions by turning the rebels' own families against them. Her weapon carefully curated favors, debts, and the unspoken understanding that crossing her meant losing access to the continent's most lucrative trade routes. This art of indirect rule required mastery of human psychology. A graduate of these secret schools knew that to control a kingdom, one must first map its invisible networks, which baron secretly resented his liege lord, which bishop coveted a richer diocese, which merchant's daughter had the ear of a prince. Like chess players thinking 10 moves ahead, they cultivated relationships that would bear fruit years later. Blanche of Navarre, regent of Champagne in the 12th century, famously kept a ledger not of finances, but of personal weaknesses, recording which knights gambled recklessly, which abbots feared scandal, which counselors longed for titles. When crisis struck, she didn't need armies. She simply activated these levers, knowing exactly which pressure points would yield cooperation. The training emphasized adaptability. Where a king might command obedience, these women practiced the delicate dance of making others believe they were following their own will. Take Adelaide of Susa, the Italian marchioness who mediated between emperors and popes. Her strategy was never to openly oppose but to reframe, presenting her preferred outcome as the inevitable solution, her allies as impartial advisors, her enemies' ideas as dangerously radical. When Henry IV marched into Italy, Adelaide didn't confront him. She hosted lavish banquets where her scholars casually debated historical precedents for imperial overreach until Henry's own advisors began quoting her arguments back to him. Some of their most potent work happened through proxy. While medieval chronicles fixated on kings and battles, the real power often flowed through marriages brokered by women like Agnes of Burgundy. By placing her nieces in strategic unions across Europe, she created a kinship network that could mobilize everything from grain shipments to papal petitions. A word whispered by Agnes's sister in Aquitaine could trigger tax reforms in Anjou or troop movements in Provence, all without a single royal edict. These weren't just family connections, they were living diplomatic channels maintained through coded letters and the trusted messengers who knew which perfumed seal meant urgency. Perhaps their most underestimated tool was the deliberate cultivation of reputation. A woman trained in these schools understood that perception could be as potent as any army. Elena of Aquitaine, during her imprisonment by Henry II, transformed her captivity into a strategic asset, allowing rumors of her mistreatment to circulate until the Pope himself intervened. Others, like the Byzantine Princess Anna Damascene, perfected the art of visible humility, dressing plainly while secretly directing policy, so that critics dismissed her as harmless until their estates mysteriously lost imperial favor. The true measure of their success, how thoroughly their influence was erased from official records. Chronicles praised kings for victories these women engineered, attributed wise laws to male advisors they'd coached, and depicted their interventions as mere coincidence. Yet the parchment trails remain in marginal notes, dowry contracts, and the occasional frustrated cleric's complaint about petticoat government. Their legacy wasn't just in the battles won or treaties signed, but in proving that power, once stripped of its pageantry, is nothing more than the ability to make the world move at your whisper. In the dim glow of candlelit chambers where silk curtains muffled whispers, young women mastered a skill more valuable than swords, the art of making words disappear. Cryptography wasn't just a lesson in these secret schools, it was a lifeline. Imagine a noblewoman's chamber where what appeared to be an innocent embroidery project held the key to a rebellion's timing, or a lute's melody carried the coordinates of a hidden ally's location. These girls didn't just learn to write, they learned to rewrite reality, turning everyday objects into vessels of clandestine power. The methods were as ingenious as they were varied. Invisible inks brewed from lemon juice, milk, or even alum transformed love letters into military dispatches when held over a flame. A Venetian manual from the 14th century details how students practiced writing between the lines of religious texts, their hidden messages legible only when the parchment was tilted toward light. More advanced techniques involved steganography, hiding messages in plain sight. A tapestry's floral border might encode troop movements, with each flower species representing a different battalion and the stitch count indicating their numbers. Music became another powerful medium. A court composer in Burgundy reportedly crafted madrigals where the rhythm of certain notes spelled out the names of conspirators. But the true brilliance lay in the systems they created. Unlike simple substitution ciphers, these women developed layered codes that changed weekly, often based on literary references only the educated would recognize. A letter discussing Dido's lament might reference a political betrayal, while a seemingly casual remark about Penelope's weaving could signal delays in a planned revolt. The Moorish schools of Granada took it further, teaching girls to encode messages within mathematical equations, a skill that allowed one queen to transmit battle plans disguised as a merchant's accounting ledger. The risks of interception necessitated constant innovation. In Byzantium, students practiced book ciphers, where page numbers, line positions, and word counts in widely available texts became keys to decode messages. A single copy of Homer's Odyssey might unlock a network of spies across 3 continents. Others relied on personal symbols. A noblewoman in Aquitaine famously used the marginal doodles of birds in her psalter to indicate which bishops supported her cause, with wing positions revealing their level of commitment. What set these cryptographic techniques apart was their seamless integration into feminine pursuits. While men guarded castles, women guarded knowledge, passing messages through the embroidery frames they were expected to mind, or hiding maps in the illuminated manuscripts they were praised for creating. A nun in Saxony smuggled intelligence out of a besieged city by stitching a coded map into an altar cloth. Her devotional work carried past enemy lines by unsuspecting priests. Another in Florence used the recipe book she'd been gifted at her wedding to encode the weaknesses of her husband's allies, each ingredient substitution hinting at a political vulnerability. The legacy of this training echoes in history's quietest corners. When Margaret of Anjou coordinated Lancaster resistance during the Wars of the Roses, her adversaries never suspected the real battle plans traveled in the sleeves of her ladies-in-waiting, written in a cipher based on Provençal poetry. Centuries later, scholars would uncover the truth not in battle chronicles, but in the margins of a music book where notes too precise to be accidental revealed a system so sophisticated it predated modern encryption by 500 years. These women didn't just break codes, they rewrote the rules of power itself, proving that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one you see, but the one you never notice until it's too late. The candlelight that once illuminated secret lessons began to flicker as Europe staggered toward modernity. What had thrived in the cracks between power structures found itself squeezed by forces far beyond the control of even the most cunning tutors. The Protestant Reformation's fierce scrutiny of all education outside church control struck first. Where once a convent scriptorium could hide political treatises among psalters, now zealous reformers inventoried every shelf. Martin Luther's push for universal literacy ironically backfired for elite women. As village schools proliferated for boys, the intricate networks of noble patronage that sustained advanced female education unraveled. Meanwhile, the Catholic Counter-Reformation doubled down on orthodoxy. Jesuit inspectors trained to root out heresy proved alarmingly adept at spotting disguised curricula. A nun teaching rhetoric might once have passed unnoticed, but now faced interrogation about why her students could quote Cicero better than catechism. The Council of Trent's reforms standardized religious education with suffocating precision, leaving no room for the creative dualities these schools relied upon. When Spanish inspectors burned a Toledo abbey's library in 1562, they weren't just destroying books, they were erasing centuries of accumulated technique for hiding philosophy behind piety. Perhaps the cruelest blow came from an unexpected quarter, the rise of universities, as these all-male institutions became gatekeepers to legal and medical professions. They actively excluded women while absorbing the very subjects, law, medicine, advanced mathematics, that had once been the secret school's specialties. A noblewoman in 15th century Paris might have studied Aristotle with a private tutor. By 1600, that knowledge was locked behind Latin lectures she couldn't attend. The intellectual playing field didn't just tilt, it shattered. economic shifts accelerated the decline. The merchant class's growing influence prioritized practical skills over the aristocratic arts of diplomacy and strategy. A daughter taught to manage estates was valuable. One versed in cryptography became a liability in an era of increasing bureaucratic transparency. Even the Medici, longtime patrons of unconventional learning, redirected funds to male-dominated academies that promised tangible returns. Some schools adapted brilliantly but fatally. In Prague, a last bastion of female scholarship reconfigured itself as a salon for alchemy, only to be crushed when Rudolf II's occult interests fell from favor. Others went deeper underground. Venetian records hint at a ladies' geometrical society meeting in gondolas under cover of fog, but by the Baroque era, even these shadows had dissipated. The final irony, Renaissance humanism, which resurrected classical knowledge, proved more hostile to women's education than the medieval world had ever been. Where once a girl might debate Plato in a convent courtyard, now she was praised for silent needlework inspired by Greco-Roman motifs, yet the disappearance wasn't total. Fragments survived in unexpected places: a French governess teaching chess as military strategy, a Dutch merchant's widow using her recipe book to school daughters in maritime law. Like the palimpsests these women had once studied, their legacy merely awaited the right light to be read again. Whispers of these clandestine schools grew wilder with each passing century, morphing from whispers of political influence into full-blown legends of witchcraft and forbidden arts. By the Renaissance, rumor had transformed Byzantine princesses into sorceresses who could control the weather, and Moorish scholars into enchantresses weaving spells through poetry. Even the infamous Black Queen myth of 15th century France, where a noblewoman was accused of teaching dark magic, traces back to a misremembered account of a secret academy teaching cryptography and herbal medicine. The truth, as always, was far more revolutionary than fiction. Historians now peel back these layers of myth using tools the schools themselves would have appreciated: meticulous analysis and hidden clues. A letter from 11th century Germany, once dismissed as romantic verse, was recently decoded as a curriculum checklist, its floral imagery revealing lessons on land appraisal and grain taxation. The so-called witch's grimoire, discovered in a Spanish convent, actually a cipher manual, its spells detailing how to encrypt troop movements using embroidery patterns. Even the notorious dancing plague of 1516, long attributed to mass hysteria, may have roots in a disrupted network of women trained to coordinate protests through choreographed signals. The most persistent myth, that these schools taught seduction as a weapon, crumbles under scrutiny. While later centuries reduced their graduates to femme fatales, the real training emphasized intellectual dominance. Consider the case of Marguerite de Navarre, whose legendary charm was actually her ability to quote canon law verbatim during treaty negotiations, or the Byzantine Princess Anna Komnine, whose alleged bewitchment of scholars was simply her encyclopedic knowledge of military history. These women didn't enchant courts with magic, they outthought them with superior education. Modern archaeology confirms their pragmatic legacy. In the ruins of a Burgundian castle, researchers found a chapel whose walls were lined with sound-dampening tapestries perfect for covert lectures. Beneath a Venetian palazzo, a chest of embroidery silks contained thread samples dyed with rare minerals, used to demonstrate chemical messaging techniques. Even the stars aided their cause. A recently discovered astrolabe from Moorish Cordoba bears feminine handwriting calculating not just celestial positions, but the optimal timing for tax collections based on harvest cycles. Perhaps the greatest testament to their reality lies in the panic they provoked. when the Church banned certain convents from teaching arithmetic in 1420, or when a French king forbade noblewomen from studying Latin. These weren't reactions to magic, they were terrified responses to measurable influence. The real sorcery was knowledge itself and its power to make the invisible visible. As one exasperated bishop wrote in 1395, "The devil's greatest trick was convincing men that women couldn't read." The echoes of those medieval classrooms can still be heard in the hallways of modern women's colleges, though few realize the connection. When Vassar College opened its doors in 1865, its founders emphasized rigorous academics over domestic skills, a revolutionary idea at the time, yet one that would have felt familiar to a Byzantine princess studying military logistics or a Moorish noblewoman debating astronomy. The thread linking these eras isn't just about education for women, it's about education as a form of quiet rebellion, a way to carve out spaces of influence in worlds that resisted change. Consider the parallels between medieval convents and early women's universities. Both relied on strategic framing to justify their existence. Just as 7th century abbesses claimed they were teaching scripture while actually instructing girls in land management, 19th century educators argued that educated women made better mothers, a socially acceptable cover for teaching advanced mathematics and philosophy. The founders of Smith and Wellesley even borrowed architectural cues from monastic cloisters, designing campuses that balanced openness with seclusion, much like the walled gardens where medieval scholars once gathered. The curriculum itself carries traces of those clandestine lessons. Modern leadership programs for women often emphasize negotiation tactics and strategic networking skills medieval tutors would have recognized instantly. When Harvard's Kennedy School teaches soft power diplomacy, it's reviving techniques perfected by Elena of Aquitaine's protégés. Even the case study method, pioneered by women's colleges in the 1880s, mirrors the way Byzantine princesses analyzed historical battles to prepare for political crises. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the unbroken belief that knowledge circumvents barriers. Just as a 12th century countess used her understanding of feudal law to protect her lands, 20th century suffragists leveraged their classical educations to argue for voting rights. The legal briefs of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, packed with meticulous historical references, owe as much to these medieval traditions as to modern law schools. Both recognize that authority flows from mastery of systems, not just passion. Today's debates about gender gaps in STEM fields feel eerily familiar to anyone who knows this history. The Moorish academies of Cordoba proved 800 years ago that women excelled in mathematics and astronomy when given the chance. Their graduates contributed to advancements in optics and cartography long before universities admitted female students. Modern initiatives encouraging girls in coding or engineering aren't radical new ideas. They're reclaiming territory these medieval scholars once occupied. Yet the greatest lesson these schools left isn't about subjects or syllabi. It's about redefining what education makes possible. When Malala Yousafzai advocates for girls' schooling today, she channels the same understanding that empowered medieval queens. Knowledge doesn't just fill minds, it reshapes destinies. The ivy-covered walls of contemporary campuses may look different from torch-lit palace chambers, but their essential promise remains unchanged, that behind every great woman, there wasn't just a great teacher, but an unbroken chain of them stretching back centuries. Hidden between the lines of prayer books and tucked beneath the covers of household ledgers, the scattered remains of these schools' teachings have survived against all odds. One of the most revealing discoveries is a 13th century psalter from a French convent, its margins crammed with notes that transform sacred verses into political lessons. Next to a psalm praising wisdom, A student scribbled comparisons between King Solomon's judgments and contemporary inheritance laws. Another annotated a verse about mighty fortresses, with diagrams of siege engine placements, proof that devotion and military strategy were never mutually exclusive in these classrooms. Far more provocative are the personal diaries that slipped through the cracks of history. The Journal of Beatrice of Nuremberg, a 15-year-old student in a Bavarian noblewoman's household, reads like a spy's training manual disguised as a girl's musings. Her entry for May 12, 1403, begins with complaints about a tight-fitting gown before abruptly shifting to a cipher key for interpreting her uncle's tax records. Later pages dissect a betrothal contract clause by clause, her commentary revealing how these schools taught girls to spot loopholes that could determine the fate of entire duchies. Perhaps the most startling survival is a battered copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, owned by Isabella d'Este's lesser-known cousin Lucrezia. While male scholars debated the text openly, Lucrezia's version bears underlinings and rebuttals in delicate handwriting. Where Machiavelli warns rulers to be feared rather than loved, she scribbles, "Only a man who's never governed a household would think them separate." Her annotations transform the infamous manual into a dialogue, proving these women weren't just passive students, they were refining political theory itself. The Moorish academies left traces too subtle for casual observers. A geometry textbook in the University of Al-Qarawiyyan's collection contains feminine handwriting solving problems about land division. Except the measurements match actual border disputes between 11th century Taifa kingdoms. Elsewhere, a cookbook from Granada lists recipes for candied apricots alongside notes on which Berber clans preferred, which spices a seemingly domestic detail that doubles as a primer on alliance building through gift diplomacy. Most poignant are the fragments that hint at daily life. A letter from a Venetian schoolmistress to her pupils warns, "Remember, the ink that writes a poem can also forge a passport." A set of wax tablets from a German convent preserves a half-erased debate exercise, two girls arguing whether Queen Esther's beauty or her strategic fasting ended the Persian crisis. Even the stains on these pages tell stories. One manuscript bears a ring-shaped wine mark beside a passage about toasting to enemies' health without drinking, suggesting practical lessons in subterfuge. These surviving texts share a common thread. They refuse to be just one thing. A devotional book is also a legal manual. A love letter contains troop movements. A child's handwriting practices double as cipher drills. In their layered purpose, they embody the school's core philosophy that knowledge, like power, thrives best when disguised as something ordinary. The real miracle isn't that these fragments survived, but that we've learned to read them at all, decoding centuries of brilliance hidden in plain sight. For every noblewoman who championed these secret schools, there were a dozen voices raised in alarm. The backlash wasn't just disapproval, it was fear. Fear of women who could outmaneuver bishops in theological debates, fear of daughters who understood tax codes better than their stewards, fear of entire power structures trembling before the quiet revolution of educated minds. In 1244, the Archbishop of Mainz raged against unnatural women who twist scripture to their purposes. His fury directed at a Rhineland convent where nuns were caught annotating papal bulls with legal counterarguments. The crackdowns often came in waves, mirroring broader political tensions. When the Albigensian Crusade swept through southern France, entire libraries of secular knowledge, including women's political treatises, were burned as collateral damage. A Venetian Doge's 1289 decree banning female assemblies exceeding 3 persons specifically targeted the salon-like study groups flourishing in patrician households. Even in relatively tolerant Moorish Spain, the Maliki jurist Ibn Rushd issued a fatwa condemning mixed-gender poetry circles, unaware that his own niece was using those gatherings to teach cryptography through verse. Some schools fell to brute force. The infamous raid on Poitiers' Rose Court in 1312 saw armed guards tearing apart embroidery frames searching for hidden maps, their violence justified by rumors of witchcraft. Others succumbed to subtler pressures. A Burgundian countess dissolved her academy after her son's prospective in-laws objected to overeducated brides, while a Florentine banking family quietly ended their daughter's tutorials when the Medici hinted it might affect their credit line. Yet for every institution crushed, 3 more adapted. The nuns of Quedlinburg, accused of heresy for teaching astronomy, simply shifted their star charts into illuminated initials of prayer books. A Parisian salon moved its meetings to a different noble house each week, its location signaled by the arrangement of flowers in market stalls. The most resilient developed early warning systems, a network of messenger pigeons linking convents across Bavaria, or the Venetian school that used gondolier songs to broadcast danger signals. What's striking is how the Backlash often revealed the school's very power. When English Parliament passed 1431's Act Against Secret Conclaves, its vague wording betrayed lawmakers' panic at women influencing property disputes. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnene's ban on female tutors in 1170 wasn't about morals. It followed his sister's failed coup, orchestrated by graduates of her clandestine academy. Even the Church's obsession with controlling female literacy speaks volumes. Why fear a woman reading unless her words might change the world? The survivors thrived by weaponizing stereotypes. A Swiss school posed as a pious sewing circle while teaching law through embroidery patterns of courtroom scenes. A Castilian noblewoman's Book of Hours contained marginal notes analyzing her husband's battle formations, the perfect hiding place, since no knight would bother reading a devotional text. Their greatest defense remained society's blind spot, the assumption that a woman with a quill was copying recipes, not drafting treaties. By the Renaissance, the Backlash had won in letter but not in spirit. Though formal schools dwindled, their knowledge dispersed through grandmothers' stories, encrypted cookbooks, and the carefully curated libraries of progressive convents. When Mary Wollstonecraft penned her 18th-century manifesto for women's education, she stood on the shoulders of centuries of hidden pedagogues, women who'd proven that no decree could extinguish the human hunger to learn, no matter who dared to teach it. Across the Himalayas and beyond the Silk Road, variations of these secret academies flourished in societies that never exchanged a single letter with medieval Europe. In the Tang dynasty's bustling capital of Chang'an, aristocratic daughters studied in pavilions where calligraphy brushes traced not just characters, but the unspoken rules of imperial politics. The poet Yu Xuanji, celebrated for her verse, was also a product of such tutelage. Her sharp critiques of court factionalism hidden within metaphors about plum blossoms and mountain mist. Meanwhile, in India's Gupta Empire, royal women like Princess Prabhavati received classical training in statecraft alongside Sanskrit poetry, later governing vast territories as regents with a blend of administrative precision and cultural patronage. The parallels are striking. Just as Moorish schools used mathematics to teach strategy, Chinese academies employed the game of Go as a masterclass in territorial control. Noblewomen analyzed historical campaigns through the lens of Sun Tzu's Art of War, but with a twist. They practiced rewriting outcomes by adjusting variables like supply routes or peasant morale. One surviving scroll from the Song dynasty shows a teenage girl's meticulous notes comparing 3 different sieges, her commentary emphasizing not weaponry, but the psychology of besieged populations. a lesson she'd later apply when negotiating famine relief for her husband's province. India's traditions took a different but equally sophisticated path. The Gurukuls for Kshatriya girls in Kashmir and Bengal blended martial arts with political philosophy, teaching young women to wield both the dagger and the diplomatic missive. Manuscripts from Vijayanagara describe princesses participating in mock court debates, where defending a position on tax reform required quoting from the Arthashastra while demonstrating archery skills. This holistic approach reflected a cultural view that saw no contradiction between the physical and intellectual arts, a sharp contrast to Europe's compartmentalized ideals. What united these disparate systems was their shared understanding of indirect influence. A Khmer queen's mastery of temple architecture wasn't just aesthetic, it positioned her as the spiritual and economic hub of Angkor's water management system. The Japanese Nihon cloistered imperial women used their enforced seclusion to build parallel networks of power, communicating through poetry exchanges that doubled as policy discussions. When the Heian-era lady-in-waiting Murasaki Shikabu penned The Tale of Genji, she wasn't merely entertaining the court, she was dissecting its power dynamics through fiction, creating a primer for generations of women navigating aristocratic intrigue. Yet the contrasts revealed just as much as the similarities. Where European schools often operated under threat of suppression, many Asian institutions enjoyed periods of official patronage. The Korean Goryeo dynasty's Hall of Worthies included female scholars who advised kings on Confucian reforms, while Mughal India's noble women like Jahanara Begum founded entire libraries and literary salons. This relative tolerance allowed for astonishing specialization. Ottoman records from Topkapi Palace detail a school of celestial strategy where imperial concubines studied astronomy to time military campaigns with celestial events, their calculations precise enough to predict lunar eclipses years in advance. The most fascinating differences emerge in teaching methods. Chinese academies employed butterfly letters, essays written on delicate paper and folded into intricate shapes, forcing students to argue their points with concision to avoid tearing the medium. In contrast, Javanese court schools used wayang shadow puppetry to teach succession crises, with noble women manipulating leather figures to act out coups and treaties. Persianate traditions favored the mirror for princes genre, but with a gendered twist. Princesses analyzed these manuals not as passive readers, but as critics who annotated margins with sharp rebuttals to male authors' assumptions. These global echoes suggest something profound, that wherever patriarchal systems concentrated power, resourceful women carved out spaces to master its rules. Whether through a Byzantine princess's cipher or a Tang noblewoman's politically charged poetry, the impulse was identical: to turn societal constraints into camouflage for education. The variations in method, go boards instead of chess sets, puppet plays rather than morality dramas, simply prove how adaptable this quiet revolution could be. When a Rajput queen like Mirabai used devotional songs to critique warlord policies, or when a Heian poetess like Ono no Kamachi wielded seasonal imagery to shame corrupt officials, they were all playing the same game. The board looked different, but the strategy was universal. Behind every empress who rewrote history or noblewoman who outmaneuvered kings stood an often overlooked figure, the mentor. These weren't just teachers, they were battle-scarred veterans of court politics, women who had survived the treacherous currents of power and now dedicated their twilight years to ensuring the next generation wouldn't merely survive but dominate. Picture a Byzantine palace anteroom where a silver-haired former lady-in-waiting, her fingers still ink-stained from decades of drafting edicts, demonstrated how to spot a forged signature, not by describing it, but by producing 3 nearly identical samples and challenging her pupil to identify the fake. This was education stripped of theory, distilled into pure, unspoken instinct. The mentor's value lay in her scars. A retired diplomat from Cordoba didn't just teach negotiation tactics. She recreated the exact moment the Emir of Seville's nostrils flared before conceding a trade dispute, drilling her students on how to exploit that tell. In Burgundy, a widowed countess who'd lost half her lands to a crafty uncle used her own failed marriage contracts as case studies, showing where the loopholes had been and how to sew them shut next time. These women traded in something no male tutor could offer: the lived experience of wielding influence without the privilege of open authority. Their methods were unorthodox by design. One Venetian mentor famously began each lesson by having students draft 2 versions of the same letter, one for public record, another with the true message hidden in the spacing between words. In Paris, a former abbess-turned-tutor staged elaborate dinner parties where students practiced reading micro-expressions while simultaneously monitoring servants for eavesdroppers. The most effective mentors understood that power wasn't just about what you knew, but how you concealed knowing it. Like the Moorish scholar who taught advanced mathematics through embroidery patterns, her students absorbing geometry while producing harmless needlework for prying eyes. These relationships often blurred the line between education and espionage. A mentor in Constantinople's Imperial school maintained a network of former pupils across 3 continents, their coded letters becoming real-time case studies for current students. When the Holy Roman Empire's succession crisis erupted in 1198, her classroom dissected each faction's moves using intelligence smuggled in by alumni, some now serving as those very factions' trusted advisors. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where each generation refined the lessons before passing them onward. What made these mentors truly revolutionary was their willingness to expose vulnerability. Where male tutors taught from positions of assumed authority, these women shared their failures as intently as their triumphs. The Saxon nun Hertzwitha's training manuals included detailed postmortems of her own political miscalculations, analyzing how overconfidence in her Latin skills nearly cost her abbey its independence. Such radical honesty transformed classrooms into laboratories where mistakes weren't shamed, but reverse-engineered into wisdom. The bond between mentor and pupil often transcended the academic. When the formidable Elena of Aquitaine took the young Marguerite of France under her wing, their lessons extended far beyond statecraft. Elena schooled her in everything from managing chronic pain during lengthy councils to calibrating tears for maximum political effect. This holistic approach recognized that female power in medieval worlds required mastery of both the grand and the granular. A graduate might need to draft a treaty one day and detect poison in her wine the next. Yet these mentors' greatest legacy was their anonymity. Few names survive in official records, just fleeting references to the lady tutor or the princess's instructress. Their invisibility was both shield and weapon, allowing them to operate in plain sight. A visiting bishop might compliment a noble girl's polished Latin without realizing the elderly woman spinning wool in the corner had once used that same skill to negotiate the ransom of a king. Today, as historians piece together their influence from marginalia and oral traditions, one truth emerges: the most powerful lessons often came from those the world had already dismissed as irrelevant. A portrait of a 15th-century Italian noblewoman might seem like a simple celebration of beauty until you notice the angle of the book in her hands. Not resting gently on her lap as decorum dictated, but held open at a precise 45-degree angle, revealing just enough of its pages to show mathematical diagrams. This wasn't carelessness by the artist, it was a coded celebration of learning, a silent rebellion stitched into the fabric of accepted tradition. Across medieval and Renaissance art, these hidden declarations appeared in the most unexpected places: a tapestry's border filled not with flowers, but with tiny ships arranged in naval formation, or a stained glass saint holding a scroll whose unrolled edge subtly mimicked the coastline of a contested border region. The symbolism often drew from accepted motifs, twisting them to new purposes. A popular depiction of the Virgin Mary reading became a template for noblewomen's portraits, but where Mary's book was invariably closed, her earthly counterparts' volumes lay open, their pages filled with legible text. In one Burgundian painting, a duchess points to a passage in a psalter that, when decoded, quotes not scripture but a treatise on grain taxation. Even jewelry carried meaning. A ruby pendant might represent marital devotion to casual observers, but those trained in iconography knew its placement at the throat signaled mastery of rhetoric, a nod to Cicero's belief that persuasive speech emanated from the neck. Tapestries offered particularly rich ground for hidden messages. The famous Lady and the Unicorn series, long celebrated for its beauty, conceals layers of political commentary. In the side panel, the lady holds a mirror reflecting not her face but a distant castle, a visual pun on surveillance techniques taught in covert academies. The unicorn at her side, traditionally a symbol of purity, wears a collar with links shaped like chess pawns, hinting at strategic thinking. Such details weren't just decorative, they were diplomas in thread, publicly displaying education while remaining innocuous to the untrained eye. Music manuscripts provided another ingenious medium. A choir book commissioned by Isabella of Castile features ornate initials that, when examined closely, contain tiny portraits of women debating over astrolabes and legal texts. The melody lines winding through the page's form shapes a bell tower here, a ship's sail there that correspond to mnemonic devices for recalling treaty terms. Even the seemingly random distribution of colorful notes held meaning. In one antiphonary from Florence, the red notes spell out a cipher key when read vertically. The most daring symbolism appeared in religious art, where sacred themes provided perfect cover. A fresco of Saint Catherine in a Bolognese convent shows the saint's traditional wheel of martyrdom replaced by a celestial globe, its constellations accurately depicting the night sky during an important peace summit. The donor portrait below, a group of nuns holds not prayer books but architectural plans for the very chapel housing the fresco. Such brazen displays worked precisely because they exploited societal blindness. What cleric would dare accuse a saint's image of subversion? These artistic clues did more than just conceal knowledge. They created a parallel language. A woman gazing at a portrait of her grandmother holding a compass knew she was looking at more than a family heirloom. She was seeing a manifesto. When a tapestry designer wove a map of Venetian trade routes into a scene of pastoral leisure, she wasn't just showcasing skill. She was preserving vital intelligence in wool and silk. The very act of creating such works became a form of pedagogy, teaching each generation how to hide truth in beauty's plain sight. What makes these hidden declarations so poignant is their duality. They were both triumphant and cautious. A book painted with legible text celebrated literacy, but the fact it had to be disguised as a prop reveals the constraints these women navigated. The artistry lay in balancing revelation with plausible deniability, ensuring that those who knew how to look could see the truth, while others saw only what they expected. In this way, a single painting could be both a personal declaration of intellect and a strategic feint, its real meaning flickering like candlelight, visible only to those trained to perceive its glow. Beneath the surface of language drills and diplomatic theory, these schools cultivated something far more subtle, a mastery of the mind itself. Imagine a 14-year-old noblewoman, her hands steady as she plays a lute, while her tutor suddenly announces that her closest friend has been spreading lies about her to the court. The girl's fingers don't falter, her breath remains even. This wasn't cruelty, it was training. Emotional control wasn't just a virtue in medieval courts, it was survival. A single tear at the wrong moment could reveal weakness, while unchecked anger might tip one's hand in negotiations. The most elite academies designed psychological gauntlets that would make modern special forces trainers nod in respect. Timed problem-solving turned high-pressure decision-making into second nature. Students might be given 15 minutes to draft a response to a fabricated rebellion, using only the resources listed in a chaotic ledger, forcing them to distinguish between vital information and noise. In Moorish Spain, advanced pupils participated in shadow councils, where they debated real political crises with incomplete information, their tutors deliberately feeding them contradictory reports to simulate the fog of court intrigue. The goal wasn't just to find answers, but to function flawlessly under the weight of uncertainty. The cruelest and most effective exercises involved orchestrated betrayals. A trusted maid might suddenly produce a discovered letter implicating the student in scandal, or a favorite tutor would coldly dismiss years of hard work as inadequate. These staged crises taught girls to pass truth from manipulation while maintaining unreadable composure. Venetian archives describe a particularly brutal exercise where students were made to defend an unpopular policy before a jeering court of older pupils, their every flinch or hesitation noted for later critique. The lesson: power often requires standing alone, but resilience training went beyond stoicism. Students learned to weaponize perception, turning their emotional restraint into a strategic tool. Byzantine manuals detail mirror drills, where girls practiced facial expressions until they could summon a convincing look of bafflement during interrogations, or radiate serene confidence while receiving devastating news. One notorious exercise from a Burgundian school involved reciting poetry while tutors shouted insults. The true test came afterward, when students had to analyze which provocations had nearly broken their focus and why. Perhaps the most ingenious psychological training lay in the art of controlled vulnerability. Unlike men who could dominate through brute force, these women mastered the strategic reveal, knowing when a carefully timed tear or well-placed confession could disarm enemies more effectively than any bluff. A Swiss convent's records describe students' role-playing as accused heretics, learning to turn interrogators' questions back on themselves with a mix of calculated humility and devastating logic. The true measure of this training's success lies in historical moments that would have broken lesser minds. When Elena of Aquitaine was captured by her husband's forces and imprisoned for 16 years, she didn't languish. She quietly gathered intelligence through her guards, eventually negotiating her release by exploiting her captor's underestimation of her resolve. Centuries later, Catherine de' Medici would credit her survival in the cutthroat French court to the ice and fire drills of her Florentine tutors, who'd forced her to alternate between outbursts and icy calm until she could switch between them at will. This psychological armor didn't produce cold, unfeeling automatons. It forged women who could think 3 moves ahead in a world where one misstep meant ruin. Their training recognized a fundamental truth. In the chess game of medieval power, the strongest piece wasn't the knight or the queen, but the player's own unshakable mind. And that was a lesson no enemy could ever capture or counterfeit. Behind every secret school's locked doors lay an even more carefully guarded secret: the identities of those who paid for the ink, the tutors, and the candlelight that kept knowledge burning. Contrary to what one might expect, these weren't always rebellious feminists or radical thinkers. The financial backers ranged from calculating monarchs to pragmatic merchants, each with motives as layered as the school's own disguises. Take the case of Duchess Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century powerhouse who inherited vast lands and no male heir. Her decision to fund a clandestine academy in the Apennines wasn't altruism, it was geopolitical calculus. By educating the daughters of rival noble houses, she wove a web of indebtedness that would later help her defy emperors and shape papal elections. Progressive monarchs played both sides of the game. Alfonso X of Castile, dubbed the Wise for his scholarly pursuits, quietly diverted funds from his famed Toledo translation schools to a parallel institution for noble women. His reasoning, a court insider's memoir, reveals the king's belief that a kingdom's strength lies in its hidden sinews, meaning the educated women who would manage frontier fortresses while men were at war. Similar pragmatism drove the Byzantine Empress Irene to sponsor a palace school where girls studied military logistics, her end game ensuring the empire's defenses wouldn't collapse if or when she needed to purge the army's disloyal generals. Perhaps the most unexpected patrons were the merchant dynasties of Venice and Bruges. The Pisani family's ledgers from 1342 list payments to a certain Madonna Isabella for instruction in accounts, a euphemism for teaching their daughters to audit trading partners' books for signs of fraud. These urban elites recognized what kings grasped only later. Educated women amplified family fortunes. A Genoese silk merchant's daughter fluent in Arabic could renegotiate contracts in Alexandria, while a banker's wife versed in Lombard law might salvage collateral from a defaulted loan. The funding mechanisms were as ingenious as the curricula. Some schools operated under the guise of charitable dowry funds, where wealthy families' donations actually purchased tutoring hours instead of future husbands. Others were embedded in convents as scriptorium projects. Every copied psalm subsidized a politics lesson. The most sophisticated formed patronage networks resembling modern venture capital circles. The Consortium of the Rose, a 15th century Florentine group, pooled resources to educate promising girls from modest backgrounds, then placed them as advisors in powerful households. Their return on investment, influence at a fraction of the cost of bribing male officials. Yet these financial webs had vulnerabilities. When the Sforza family's Milanese bank collapsed in 1478, 3 secret schools lost their primary funding overnight. Records from a rescued chest revealed desperate letters between tutors about selling the astronomy globes and the Persian carpets from the debate chamber. Other institutions hedged their bets by diversifying. A Burgundian school's ledger shows income from 7 different sources: a widow's annuity, a bishop's discretionary fund, proceeds from selling medicinal herbs, and even fees for consultations, likely cipher solving for local magistrates. What united these backers, from kings to spice traders, was their understanding that knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency. A well-placed woman with tactical training could prevent a war more cheaply than raising an army. A daughter who could decode intercepted letters might save a mercantile empire from ruin. And in an era when official avenues of influence were barred to women, these schools became the ultimate insider trading, a way to cultivate human capital that would yield dividends for generations. The real miracle isn't that such institutions existed, but that their funders' names have been so thoroughly erased, their receipts burned, their account books lost, leaving us to piece together their brilliance from the faintest of fiscal fingerprints. Dawn in a medieval secret school wasn't marked by bells, but by the whisper of parchment unfurling in near darkness. Students rose while castle sentries still yawned at their posts, their first hours devoted to language drills conducted in murmurs reciting Arabic verb conjugations or Latin legal phrases into their sleeves to muffle the sound. One surviving diary from a Burgundian academy describes how girls practiced Greek by tracing letters in frost on window panes, their breath the only ink they dared waste before sunrise. The morning silence wasn't just practical, it was psychological training. As one tutor's notes reveal, he who thinks in whispers learns to hear the unspoken. After breaking their fast with honeyed bread and watered wine, students transitioned to what curriculum records euphemistically called the play of kings, strategy games played on 3 different boards simultaneously. A chess set taught battlefield tactics, while a backgammon board drilled supply chain logistics, and a custom-made map of local fiefdoms required negotiating alliances with classmates role-playing as rival nobles. The games grew more complex as students advanced. 12th century Venetian fragments describe a version where dice throws triggered plague outbreaks or harvest failures, forcing players to recalculate entire campaigns mid-move. Midday brought debates, though nothing like the structured oratory of male universities. These were rapid-fire, high-stakes exercises where changing one word could mean life or death in later court intrigues. A Milanese school's rulebook prescribed debating with a mouthful of pebbles to teach precise diction under duress, while Andalusian academies made students switch languages mid-argument from Arabic to Latin to vernacular to simulate multilingual negotiations. The most feared drill was the silent debate, where participants communicated only through facial expressions and hand gestures, a skill that later helped graduates like Beatrice of Provence sway papal conclaves without uttering a word. Privacy wasn't just a precaution, it was pedagogy. Students answered to pseudonyms borrowed from mythology or astrology. A girl called Philomela one term might become Algol the next. Personal identifying details were systematically erased. Inkwells had false bottoms to swallow incriminating notes, and charcoal pencils wrote invisibly on certain treated papers. A recovered cipher wheel from a Bohemian school shows not just letter substitutions, but layers of misdirection a second, hidden cipher within the first for truly sensitive content. Even the architecture conspired to conceal. One French chateau's sewing room featured a floor tilted ever so slightly to roll dropped papers into a hidden cavity in the wall. The day's final hours were devoted to what tutors termed the art of disappearance. Students learned to alter their handwriting styles at will, to compose letters that self-erased when exposed to candle heat, and most crucially, how to unlearn. Anecdotes describe girls being woken at random hours to recite that day's lessons backward, then destroy all notes while tutors watched for any hesitation. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. When the future Queen Constance of Sicily was captured at 16, her interrogators found her diary filled with innocent poetry. Only decades later did scholars realize the first letters of each line contained troop movements in acrostic. What modern eyes might mistake for obsessive secrecy was in fact a radical form of intellectual freedom. By stripping away all traces of authorship, these schools liberated their students to think dangerously. A girl debating under the name Cassandra could argue for republicanism without dooming her family. Another penning anonymous critiques of feudal law wasn't just learning rhetoric, she was experiencing the power of ideas untethered from identity. The ultimate lesson whispered in those candlelit chambers wasn't how to hide knowledge, but how to let it move unseen through the world, changing everything it touched while leaving no fingerprints behind. Graduates of these secret schools didn't just enter courts as advisors or wives, they became architects of shadows, weaving invisible threads between thrones. Take the case of Marguerite de Brescia, a 15th-century noblewoman whose embroidery frames concealed coded maps of Burgundian troop movements. To the untrained eye, she was another pious lady stitching altar cloths. In reality, her floral patterns marked the weak points in castle fortifications, intelligence that would later help the French King Charles VII reclaim his lands without bloodshed. These women didn't just observe history, they redirected its currents from behind tapestries and within confessionals. The training in espionage was relentless. Advanced pupils practiced listening walks through crowded marketplaces, learning to extract secrets from overlapping conversations. A Venetian manual describes an exercise where students had to reconstruct an entire dinner party's political alliances based solely on the seating chart and the dishes served. Who received the first pour of wine, which dignitary's plate lacked the expensive saffron rice. The most skilled could detect shifts in power from something as subtle as a duchess's choice of ribbon color or the sudden demotion of a once favored steward to a lower table. Some operatives specialized in active silence, the art of being present yet unnoticed. Anna of Saxony, a graduate of a Rhineland convent school, perfected the technique of blending into palace courtyards as just another face among ladies-in-waiting. Her true role, noting which guards took bribes, which ministers lingered too long near the treasury, and most crucially, which rumors the kitchen staff dismissed as absurd. Years later, her meticulously kept journals would reveal how she prevented an assassination plot against her brother by cross-referencing a stable boy's gossip with the sudden appearance of unfamiliar gloves in a nobleman's wardrobe. The true genius of these networks lay in their deniability. Unlike male spies who might be caught with incriminating documents, these women stored intelligence in plain sight. A Burgundian countess intercepted enemy dispatches by having her choir sing specific Gregorian chants when certain phrases appeared in intercepted letters, the melodies serving as mnemonics to reconstruct the text later. Another operative in Naples used the complex braiding patterns of her handmaid's hair to encode meeting times, with each twist representing a different hour and location. The system was so effective that when French invaders ransacked the city, they never suspected the elaborate hairstyles of fleeing noblewomen contained the coordinates of hidden gold reserves. Peacemaking became their most unexpected weapon. While kings waged wars, these women brokered ceasefires through bacchanal negotiations. In 1485, Beatrice of Aragon famously averted a Hungarian-Ottoman conflict by arranging a chance encounter between diplomats at her thermal bath. The steaming pools provided cover for whispered conversations, while the rhythmic pouring of water masked sensitive phrases from eavesdroppers. Her training in acoustics, a seemingly obscure subject at a Moorish alma mater, allowed her to position each speaker where their voices would carry only to intended ears. The ultimate testament to their skill, how thoroughly their contributions were erased from official records. Chroniclers ascribed diplomatic breakthroughs to divine intervention or the wisdom of male counselors, never guessing the truth. A decoded letter from the Spanish archives reveals that Isabella of Castile's legendary reconquest of Granada relied heavily on intelligence from a network of female scholars embedded in the Nasrid court, their reports hidden in shipments of porcelain, where the glazed patterns indicated troop movements. These operatives understood that true power isn't about credit, but results. Their legacy lives on not in statues or treaties, but in the unbroken chain of quiet influence stretching from medieval scriptoria to modern intelligence agencies, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone forgets to watch. The ripple effects of these secret schools stretched far beyond palace corridors and convent walls, quietly rewriting the rules of what societies believed women could or should know. At first glance, medieval chronicles seem unchanged by their existence. Kings still waged wars, bishops still preached, and women ostensibly remained confined to traditional roles. But beneath the surface, something profound was shifting. Every time a nobleman consulted his wife on tax reforms, every time a merchant deferred to his daughter's fluency in trade agreements, every time a queen regent navigated a crisis with startling competence, these moments chipped away at centuries of assumption. Like water carving through stone, the cumulative impact was transformative. Consider the curious case of 14th century Parisian salons. Once dominated by male scholars debating theology, these gatherings gradually saw women not just attending, but leading discussions on law and philosophy. The change wasn't accidental. It was the work of graduates from covert academies who'd mastered the art of steering conversations without appearing to. Their technique, framing bold ideas as extensions of male interlocutors' thoughts. As my lord husband often observes, a noblewoman might begin before introducing a revolutionary fiscal policy, her words granting men credit while subtly reshaping debate. Over decades, this dance of suggestion and deference made female erudition palatable, then expected, then indispensable. The school's cultural fingerprints appear in unexpected places. Courtly love poetry, often dismissed as frivolous romance, became a vehicle for normalizing intellectual equality. When troubadours praised ladies for their keen minds and wisdom beyond Solomon, they weren't just flattering, they were reflecting a new reality. Even religious art began depicting learned women with surprising frequency. A stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral shows Saint Anne teaching the Virgin Mary to read, a scene that would have been unremarkable to medieval viewers, proof that female education had seeped into the cultural groundwater. Perhaps the most significant shift occurred in law. Customary codes across Europe began including clauses protecting women's right to manage property, often justified as preserving family wealth. Behind these dry legal phrases lay generations of women who'd proven their financial acumen. In Lombardy, court records show wives increasingly acting as attorneys for absent husbands, their courtroom victories eroding the myth of feminine irrationality. By the Renaissance, even conservative jurists like Bartolo da Sassoferrato conceded that certain women might possess masculine understanding, a grudging admission that cracked the door for future arguments. The school's greatest triumph was making competence invisible. When Christine de Pizan became Europe's first professional female writer in the early 1500s, critics attributed her success to exceptional circumstance. They missed the truth her education wasn't an anomaly, but the product of a centuries-old tradition finally stepping into the light. Like a tapestry viewed from the wrong side, the pattern seemed chaotic until one pulled back to see how every thread connected. The women who negotiated peace at Tours in 1444, who managed Medici banking networks, who advised popes on canon law, they weren't miracles. They were graduates. This cultural revolution moved at glacial speed with frequent reversals. Each generation's hard-won progress could vanish in a wave of plague or warfare, forcing the next to rebuild. Yet the foundation held, however fragmented, however disguised, the idea that women might think as deeply as men had been planted. It would take centuries to bear full fruit, but the roots, once established, proved impossible to eradicate. The true measure of these schools' success isn't in laws changed or battles won, but in the quiet moments when a father handed his daughter a ledger instead of a dowry, when a counselor paused to ask his wife's opinion, when a little girl reached for a book instead of a spindle, and no one thought to stop her. Today's world may have traded parchment for pixels and candlelit chambers for boardrooms, but the essence of those medieval secret schools still pulses through modern institutions, just dressed in contemporary camouflage. Consider the Ivy League's final clubs or Silicon Valley's invite-only masterminds, where future CEOs and policymakers are groomed behind unmarked doors. These aren't just social clubs, they're modern-day scriptoriums where power brokers decode the algorithms of influence over whiskey and Wi-Fi. The tools have changed: spreadsheets instead of ciphers, venture capital instead of dowries, but the playbook remains startlingly familiar. Take the case of elite leadership programs for women, like those run by Fortune 500 companies or political parties. On the surface, they promise empowerment through public speaking and negotiation workshops. But dig deeper, and you'll find curricula that echo medieval tactics, teaching participants to leverage perceived weaknesses as strategic advantages, just as Byzantine princesses once turned societal dismissal into the perfect cover for espionage. A Harvard Kennedy School seminar on non-positional leadership might as well be a reboot of Adelaide of Burgundy's lessons on ruling without a crown. The tech world has become an unlikely heir to these traditions. Coding boot camps for marginalized groups often function as digital age clandestine classrooms, where students master languages far more potent than Latin or Arabic, Python, SQL, blockchain. Like their medieval counterparts memorizing ciphers in convents, these modern scholars absorb skills that unlock systems of power. One Silicon Valley initiative even replicates the Shadow Council exercises of Moorish Spain, tasking female founders with pitching startups using deliberately flawed data to simulate male-dominated investor meetings. Yet the most telling parallel lies in the unspoken rules of access. Just as medieval schools relied on whispered referrals and symbolic tokens, a rose pinned at a specific angle, a psalter held upside down, today's exclusive networks operate through algorithmic vetting and backchannel endorsements. A LinkedIn connection from the right mentor can be as decisive as a Byzantine empress's sealed letter of introduction. The difference: where medieval women hid their intellect behind embroidery frames, contemporary professionals cloak ambition in the equally acceptable disguise of networking lunches or wellness retreats. Even the Backlash mirrors ancient patterns. When a secretive women's investment group on Wall Street was outed by journalists in 2019, the outrage focused not on their strategies, but on their audacity to operate privately, echoing medieval clerics who tolerated educated women only if they performed their brilliance for male audiences. The group's crime, like that of their predecessors, wasn't incompetence. It was refusing to make their playbook legible to outsiders. Perhaps the most revolutionary evolution is happening where we least expect it. Online communities, from encrypted forums for female activists to TikTok collectives sharing corporate negotiation tactics, have democratized what was once the privilege of noble daughters. A teenager in Jakarta now learns rhetorical devices from a YouTube tutorial modeled on Anna Komnine's debate drills, while a mid-career professional in Nairobi downloads templates for salary negotiations that would make Elena of Aquitaine nod in approval. The silk curtains have been replaced by firewalls, but the mission endures: to turn knowledge into invisible armor. These modern iterations prove a timeless truth, that whenever formal systems exclude, parallel structures emerge. The medieval schools thrived not despite their secrecy, but because of it, and today's equivalents flourish under similar conditions. What's changed isn't the hunger for forbidden knowledge, but the realization that the most potent education often happens where the spotlight doesn't reach. The real lesson: power doesn't disappear when it goes underground. It just learns to move differently. The story of these secret schools doesn't end with crumbling manuscripts or forgotten convents. It lives on in the unbroken thread of women who turned limitation into leverage. Think of the Byzantine princess who disguised battle plans as love poetry, or the Moorish scholar who encoded troop movements in embroidery patterns. These weren't just clever tricks, they were acts of defiance against a world that tried to define intelligence as inherently male. The true revolution wasn't in the curriculum alone, but in the audacity to believe that knowledge, once planted, could grow in even the most hostile soil. Consider how these schools redefined power itself. While kings ruled through fear and force, their graduates mastered something far more enduring: the art of influence without spectacle. A well-placed word during a private audience, a strategically timed letter, or a carefully curated alliance could shift the fate of nations without a single sword being drawn. This was leadership stripped of theatrics, proving that the most effective rulers often worked in whispers rather than proclamations. When Elena of Aquitaine negotiated the release of her son, Richard the Lionheart, she didn't rely on armies. She leveraged her network of educated correspondents across Europe, each trained to read between the lines of official missives. The legacy of these institutions challenges our modern assumptions about progress. We imagine history as a straight line moving toward equality, but these schools reveal a more complex truth: that advances in women's education have always been fragile, won through ingenuity and preserved through discretion. The convents of Saxony and the salons of Cordoba didn't wait for permission to educate. They created their own paradigms, proving that change rarely begins with grand declarations, but with quiet acts of rebellion in candlelit rooms. What makes their story so urgent today isn't just the past it uncovers, but the future it suggests. In an era where algorithms can silence dissent as effectively as medieval decrees, their strategies feel startlingly relevant. The cryptography taught in Venetian palazzos finds its echo in encrypted messaging apps. The networked influence of Byzantine scholars mirrors modern grassroots campaigns. These women understood that when doors are barred, windows become passages, a lesson for anyone fighting inequality in new guises. As we piece together their fragmented histories, we're left with a question that transcends time. How many other revolutions have been hidden in plain sight, their architects erased not by accident but by design? The answer lies not in dusty archives alone, but in the unspoken traditions passed between generations: the grandmother who teaches her granddaughter to negotiate, the mentor who shows her protege how to navigate male-dominated spaces. The secret schools may have vanished, but their spirit persists wherever knowledge is shared in defiance of expectation. So the next time you hear a story about a remarkable woman who defied her era, look closer. Behind every anomaly lies a tradition, one that refused to be forgotten. Their greatest lesson wasn't just how to rule empires, but how to build them anew from the margins, one whispered lesson at a time.